Hello, and welcome to this edition of Wigtown Wednesdays, which is being generously sponsored by Bailey Gifford. I'm Lee Randall, and tonight's guest is the man who asks the experts, what if your advice is wrong? Award-winning science and health journalist Gary Taubes joins us from California, where I think we've rolled him out of bed at an ungodly hour. And he'll be talking to us about his best-selling books, The Case Against Sugar and The Case for Keto. But first, as always, let me just tell you, if you're able to, if you're willing to, if you can support the festival via the donate buttons on this page and on the festival website, it's hugely appreciated, and it helps bring events like this to your living room. As well, we hope you'll support all the authors by buying their books from the festival shop. Now, during this event, you can pop your questions into the chat box. I have a million questions for Gary, but we'll try to get to yours as well before the hour is over. So just to introduce him, Gary Taubes is the self-described student of pathological science. In other words, that's the study of things that are not so. So prepare to have your preconceptions challenged. And over the course of the next hour, we'll talk about things like why he considers bacon and butter to be health foods, why the energy balance idea of obesity is wrong, and why those of us who gain weight easily should banish sugar and carbohydrates and embrace a high-fat diet. So welcome, Gary. I'm so delighted to meet you, albeit electronically.
Lee, thank you for having me. And that was certainly one of the most fascinating introductions I've had yet. So I look forward to the questions.
Well, I wanted to start with this idea. You talk in both your books, you talk about the importance of understanding the history behind scientific principles. And I thought we could start with the history of pathological science. One of the things you say in the books is that science is meant to be self-correcting. But if you don't catch it soon enough, then it becomes impossible to fix. Now, my feeling is that especially where matters of nutrition, obesity, and obesity-related illnesses are concerned, and what is or isn't a healthy diet, it seems to me that this is hugely true, specifically in this general area. And I wonder if you can talk about why that situation persists.
Well, one of the issues with any science is the scientists involved tend to generate hypotheses very early on in the research. When their tools they have to study the subject are the most primitive, when they don't even know what tools they might have available to study the subjects are. And so they come up with hypotheses. And there's a line I use in virtually every one of my books, which is from the Nobel laureate physicist Richard Feynman, famous character who said, the first principle of science is you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And what happens in these subjects that, particularly those that are not amenable to easy experimental testing, is the researchers come up with these hypotheses, they believe them, they generate evidence to support them. They don't understand quite how critical they have to be about their belief systems. And then if it's a subject that involves human life and health, as diet does, people tend to embrace these hypotheses as dogma very early on. And once they're embraced, there's a famous paper written in Science called The Method of Multiple Hypotheses. This was written by one of the most famous geologists ever named Chamberlain back in 1897. It's been republished half a dozen times over the years. And Chamberlain says once you have what he calls a general ruling theory, you better hope that ruling theory is right, because you're never going to get good science again. And what happened in nutrition and obesity is they embrace these ideas, diabetes also, all this chronic disease science, they embrace these ideas very early in the science about what the cause of obesity was, what the cause of heart disease was. They embrace them on very simplistic ideas. And if you don't know that history, And researchers in medicine tend not to be taught the history of the field. And in a subject like physics, you learn it historically because it gets more complex as you go on. So the simplest stuff is the easiest stuff to learn, and you learn that first, and everything's got a name attached. Newton's laws of, gravity, Einstein's laws of relativity, Maxwell's equations. Everything is an idea and how it was tested and what the evidence showed. And that's what and often with the earliest work, you reproduce the experiments as you go on and, from high school to college and study these subjects. In medicine and nutrition, they learn very little about the history. So you have all these profound fundamental ideas that the researchers involved know nothing about the origin. And then they just continue to build on what might be bad assumptions. And among them are these ideas that we get fat because we eat too much, and we get heart disease because of the dietary fat in the diet, and everything we'll be talking about.
Yeah. Well, you do say one of the things you said in your book was that if diabetes and obesity were infectious diseases, governments would be all over them. And I don't know, we've seen how governments have been dealing with infectious diseases, so I'm not really sure anymore.
Well, but you could see the level of interest, what happens with a disease like COVID. And this wasn't a statement I made. This was a statement that the most influential diabetes specialist in the world in the first half of the 20th century was a Boston physician named Elliot Joslin, who founded the first dedicated diabetes clinic in the US, and then he wrote the textbooks. And he pointed out in an article, it was in 1921, that there was clearly a diabetes epidemic that you could see happening at the time. Mm-hmm. And he grew up in Oxford, Massachusetts, and 7 adults and 4 houses in his street, which included his mother and his aunt, all had diabetes. And he said then, if this was a chronic and infectious disease, the health departments and the insurers would be all over the neighborhood. You can imagine them in white suits with helmets and, whatever, like Ghostbusters costumes, trying to figure out what was causing the disease. But because it was a chronic disease that could be blamed on getting fat, nobody cared. And today you have the same issue. You've got an epidemic, 2 epidemics or dual epidemics that are out of control, diabetes and obesity. In the United States, diabetes prevalence has increased 700% in 60 years, which is, from 1% of the population to total 7 or 8, and adults 10, and nobody really cares. I mean, they care, but they don't question their assumptions.
This is type 2 diabetes we're talking about.
Well, both when we talk about the diabetes epidemic, it's both types are increasing in prevalence, which is interesting. The type 2 is the dominant type. 95% of all cases are what we call type 2 diabetes, and that's associated with obesity. So the assumption is the reason it's increasing in prevalence is because obesity has skyrocketed in that same time period. But the medical health establishment has made zero progress. In fact, one line I quote in my books, the former director of the World Health Organization gave a keynote address 2017 at the National Academies of Sciences annual meeting in Washington. And she talked about the diabetes and obesity epidemics, and she gave a prediction she called them slow motion disasters around the world. And then she gave a prediction for the likelihood that public health organizations like hers would not curb the epidemics, just rein them in so the rate of increase would slow down. And her prediction was 0% likelihood. And imagine if this was any infectious disease, even cigarettes and lung cancer, which is not an infectious disease, but HIV or, Ebola or COVID or you would have investigators all over the world spending, questioning every one of their assumptions. Do we really understand the cause of this disease? And here it's, no, people eat too much, or we'll blame the food industry.
Let's let's dive right into this idea of the energy balance idea, which is that if you want to lose weight, then the calories in must be lower than the calories out. It's widely accepted, it's hugely flawed, and it has, from my perspective, one of the most pernicious elements of it is the fact that it victim blames. It blames the people who are suffering for their suffering, which that gets my dander right up.
Yes, it should.
Well, so we've been told this all our lives. I used to write about this when I used to work for women's magazines back in New York, and I would write that blithely, believing it. And I certainly do know from personal experience that cutting back on calories can result in weight loss. So can you talk the audience through why this is such a flawed premise?
Well, okay, and as you pointed out, so the idea is it's really very simple. We get fat because we overeat. So maybe we eat too much food, maybe we're not physically active enough. Obesity is blamed on overeating, which is a behavior, okay, and sedentary behavior, which is a behavior. So by definition, as soon as you accept this idea that obesity is an energy balance disorder, more calories in than out, you've defined it as two different behaviors and you've made it a behavioral disorder. And now you're blaming the behavior of the patient. So everyone, again, to give you the history, which is what inevitably fascinates me, up until 1930, there was a kind of general belief that I'm going to use a very technical term here, untechnical. But instead of saying people with obesity every time, I'm going to refer to them as fat people because that's how they were referred to at the time. But the idea was people get fat because they eat too much. But there was also a competing hypothesis, which is that obesity is some kind of constitutional, hormonal, physiological defect. Some people accumulate too much fat almost regardless of how much they eat. So if they try to inhibit that fat accumulation by starving themselves, by eating less and exercising more, they could do so for a short period of time, but they'll be so hungry they won't be able to keep it up. And these two theories, you could find them in the literature, but this was a period in time when there was maybe half a dozen physicians in the world who were writing in the research literature about what the cause of obesity was. That was obesity research at the time. And the only thing they had to measure that could be seemingly related to fat accumulation was energy. They had devices called calorimeters that could measure how much energy was in foods and how much energy was expended. So they had a theory that obesity was an energy balance disorder because that's all they could measure. Mm-hmm. And then in 1930, one University of Michigan physician comes along, a very thin man named Louis Newberg, and he publishes a paper saying he's experimentally tested these hypotheses, and he has demonstrated on 7 subjects beyond a shadow of a doubt that people get fat because they eat too much. This constitutional defect hypothesis can be rejected. And the best medical science of the era, pre-World War II, was being done in Germany and Austria. That was the sort of heyday of German and Austrian medicine, even between the war years. And the Germans and Austrians made fun of this theory that obesity is caused by eating too much because they were studying obese patients and saying these people have some kind of concept. Their bodies accumulate fat very easily. But World War II came along, the Germans and Austrians sort of evaporated, their medical community evaporated, and this theory evaporated with it. And with it, we embrace this idea. So it went from this single 7-subject study by Louis Newberg that's about as ill-conceived as you could imagine to being embraced by the animal models. And the late 1930s, you get animal models of obesity for the first time. And if the animals are allowed to eat as much as they want, they would eat voraciously. So one researcher at Yale who has read Louis Newberg says, well, the animals get obese and they eat voraciously. Therefore, what we've done to them has made them eat voraciously, and that's why they get obese. But other researchers noted that the animals got obese even when they didn't eat voraciously, just like the constitutional hypothesis. In fact, the most famous animal model, I'm going to, one more thing, then I tend to make short questions long.
Hey, I'm here for that. That's great.
Yeah, the most famous animal model of obesity ever is called the Obob Mouse. OB stands for obesity. It was discovered at the Jackson Laboratories in Maine in the 1940s. And one of the most famous obesity researchers ever, named Douglas Coleman, did studies where he semi-starved these mice from the moment of weaning. So what that means is, you know, they wean for 3 weeks from their mothers, and then you can take them, and you could take a lean animal that doesn't have this Obob mutation, feed that animal a day's worth of food, measure how much it eats, cut that amount in half, and feed half of that to the animal with the mutation. So it's quite literally semi-starved, and it got obese anyway. They always get, this is one of the most common observations in all of medical science. Control for this overeating idea. Feed a animal with model of obesity. One of these, you know, could be a dietary model or genetic mutation, or the surgical models of obesity. You do what's called pair feeding, where you feed it the same amount of food as a lean animal, and it gets fatter anyway, and often it gets obese anyway. So the point is, the evidence always supported the idea that obesity was some kind of constitutional hormonal defect. But through bad luck, World War II, actually the leading researchers arguing for the constitutional hormonal defect in the animal models, one of them was the leading neuroanatomist in the United States of the era. He published a paper on this in 1942. 3 months later, he has a heart attack and dies. And his graduate student who did the work joins the Air Force because they're in the middle of World War II and never goes back to obesity research. So this one doctor at Yale changes the world with his animals get fat because they eat too much also theory. And by the 1950s and 1960s, obesity is dominated not by people studying fat metabolism or fat storage, even though those researchers are out there, but by psychologists and psychiatrists trying to get people who suffer from obesity to eat less. The history is fascinating, and nobody knows it in this field. So in a field like physics, if you ask a physicist who came up with the theory of relativity or the theory of gravity, you've insulted them, right? Because of course they know, but if you ask an obesity researcher who came up with your energy balance hypothesis of obesity, they'll get mad at you for asking, but they won't know the answer.
I also want to, this idea that carbohydrates are the problem is not new. You make it quite clear in your book on the case for keto that it's not new. It's been known about for over 100 years. So how did we become so sugar? And I know sugar is a carbohydrate, but I'm going to keep saying it separately to reinforce the fact that you wrote a whole book about it. How did we become so sugar and carbohydrate dependent? Where did that come from?
Well, yeah, so the idea that carbohydrates are fattening and that a weight loss diet will work if you preferentially restrict the carbohydrates dates to, I mean, the most famous book ever written about food is called The Physiology of Taste by a French gastronome named Jean-Antoine Briat-Savarin. He published it in 1825. He said, you know, over the years, I've wrestled with my own weight. I've interviewed, I've had dinner conversations with 500 people who suffer from obesity, and it's clear that the reason they do is because they love carbohydrates. He didn't call them carbs at the time, he called them farinaceous foods and sugars. And for a diet to prevent obesity, you had to more or less rigid abstinence from these foods. And then in 1865, the first best-selling diet pamphlet comes out. It's by a British undertaker named Banting, who says he learned from his ear doctor, who had listened to the great French physiologist Claude Bernard lecture in Paris, that if he preferentially restricted carbs, he would lose weight, and he lost 50 pounds effortlessly after struggling with his weight his whole life. And then it becomes sort of the standard of care in Europe through the 20th century. And then again, as soon as they embrace this idea that obesity is an energy balance problem with Louis Newberg from then on, then it becomes about calories. In fact, once the people are measuring energy in and energy out, then they're talking about calories, and then every calorie is identical, and you can no longer say carbohydrates are fattening. But virtually every major successful diet book, the one in 1960, Herman Thaler, Calories Don't Count, which was the title that he used for the same reason I talk about that. Atkins, Protein Power, Dukan in France, or, Sugar Busters. Every best-selling diet book was a carbohydrate restriction diet book until the low-fat craze comes along when the 1970s, 1980s, and you get people like Dean Ornish and Nathan Pritikin pushing very low-fat diets. But until then, the conventional wisdom was carbohydrates are fattening. I mean, you can find in novels, Anna Karenina, the protagonist, what's his name? Anna's lover.
Is that Vronsky?
Vronsky.
Yeah.
He's got a horse race. He goes, this is tremendously exciting horse race where he's winning at the end, and then the horse stumbles, and it's heartbreaking. They have to put the horse to sleep. But the night before the horse race, he goes to dinner, and he says he's already met his weight, so he doesn't have to worry. So he can have a big steak for dinner as long as he doesn't eat potatoes or rice, because that'll make him fat and his weight will go up. Novels are full of this idea, and what's his name? Dr. Spock, Baby and Childcare, the Bible of, child rearing in the United States from the 1950s onward. He's got like half a dozen editions or more, and in every edition up until the latest in 1990, after Spock dies, he says carbohydrates are what make people fat. And then he switches to a kind of vegetarian diet with his, the version published after his death. But it's ubiquitous. It's not a fad. It's just conventional thinking until the 1970s, when we get this idea that dietary fat causes heart disease, and now we should all eat low-fat, high-carb diets. And our governments, first the U.S., followed by the U.K., start pushing high-carb diets, and that happens to coincide with an obesity epidemic. And sugar, which is always considered sort of, a dietary, what's the right word? Evil, not evil, but a luxury, something you should eat in moderation at most, and you should avoid if you have a weight problem. This is, even in diabetes, it's interesting. I'm doing my next book on diabetes alone, and I'm obsessed with the history again. And even there's a whole group of diabetes specialists from 1923 onward, when insulin's discovered, to keep pushing higher and higher carb diets for diabetes. But they always say high carb, you can eat as much as you want, just don't eat sugar. Don't eat sweets. That's always, and then we blame fat for everything, and sugar is absolved, and the sugar consumption skyrockets again, and it coincides with obesity and diabetes epidemics.
But is it not correct? I'm leading you down the path towards explaining what a keto diet is. But first, is it not correct that carbs are metabolized differently than fats and proteins? And doesn't this lead to something called insulin resistance, aka metabolic syndrome? And is that not the crux of the problem?
It is the crux of the problem let me give you a little more history. Just beginning in the 1950s. Well, actually earlier than that even. But this idea that, we grew up with the idea that the reason you get heart disease is because your cholesterol is elevated. When you get that's what your physician believes almost assuredly, and particularly LDL cholesterol. That's a theory that kind of emerged in a large way in the 1950s, pushed by a University of Minnesota nutritionist named Ansel Keys. It was tested through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and it failed the tests, which is what's interesting. Actually, the largest test ever done in women, the Women's Health Initiative, is a $500 million diet trial of 49,000 women, and 29,000 are put on a low-fat, low meat, mostly plant diet, and they're followed for 5 years, and it has zero benefit. And they lose like 2 pounds over 5 years, even though they supposedly cut their caloric intake significantly. So but again, the public health establishment got behind this. They instituted it as sort of a dogma on many different levels, and we've never been able to get off it. While that was happening, another group of researchers were saying, wait, it's not actually the fat in the diet. It's not saturated fat raising cholesterol. It's carbohydrates, and particularly sugars, raising the triglyceride levels in your blood and making you what's called insulin resistant. So you measured insulin resistant. So you secrete insulin in response to the carbohydrates that you consume. And in the early 1960s, with a tool available to measure insulin levels in the blood, researchers realized that obese individuals and people with type 2 diabetes had high levels of insulin, so they must be resistant to the insulin they're secreting. High levels of insulin and high blood sugar. And then this evolved into this idea of metabolic syndrome. The major proponent was a Stanford University researcher named Gerald Reaven. And by the late 1980s, it was accepted that type 2 diabetes is an insulin resistance syndrome, and insulin resistance is a carbohydrate intolerance syndrome. And it slowly spread into heart disease as researchers realized, epidemiologists realized, that insulin resistance was a better marker of heart disease, predictor of heart disease, than LDL cholesterol. But by that time, we had a dogma that couldn't be dislodged.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll go to, so the insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome are definitely caused by the carbohydrate content of the diet. And if you eat more slowly digesting carbohydrates and restrict sugar, or you avoid carbohydrates entirely, this insulin resistance problem will get better or go away. And that's the best predictor we have of heart disease risk. But you go to the doctor, if you're overweight, one of the first signs of metabolic syndrome is that you're getting fatter, particularly around the waist. So your doctor's supposed to look at your waist circumference. And if you're getting fatter, he'll say, that's a sign you have metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, carbohydrate problem. Your doctor will say, you're getting fatter, you got to eat less, exercise more, and you should avoid fat and eat more carbohydrates, because if you're getting fatter, you're at higher risk of heart disease. And we know that heart disease is caused by dietary fat raising. What you're getting, by the way, in 10 minutes of me speaking quickly is what I learned over the course of about 10 years of research, doing more research on this than anyone at the time had ever done, beginning with these investigative articles for the journal Science, and then some infamous New York Times Magazine pieces, and then my books. As people often say in this field, I'm not making this up, crazy as it seems.
Well, do you know what? I wanted to ask you, I really do, I want to get you to talk about what a keto diet is, but let me just ask you really quickly. You've written these wonderful best-selling books. You've written articles for the New York Times Magazine and the Atlantic and even the BMJ. But you're always pushing against the prevailing wind. So how difficult is it for you to do this decades-long research? How hard is it to find the people who can talk to you about unconventional wisdom? And the second half of that, of course, is, and how hard do the conventionalists push back at you?
Well, remember, once a subject is accepted as dogma, you've got this. One thing I've had to do over the years is understand phenomena like groupthink and cognitive dissonance. Once a subject is accepted as dogma, it means virtually everyone in the field believes it. So some huge proportion of the people believe it, and if they should choose not to believe it with time, they you could think of it as a church, and then they get excommunicated. So everyone believes that you get fat because you eat too much, and you get heart disease because of the dietary fat raising cholesterol. If you decide otherwise, you become the one person in your community who is constantly fetching, to use the Yiddish term that my mother taught me. People don't like that. Mm-hmm. So researchers, like for instance, if you're a young researcher and you're doing your PhD thesis and you come to a conclusion different than the dogma, that you'll have trouble getting your PhD thesis past your advisor, you'll have trouble getting it published, you'll have trouble getting jobs, you'll have trouble getting research funding. I interviewed a year ago for the diabetes book, a guy who started a diabetes research group at one of the large U.S. pharmaceutical companies. And he said, he's worried that if he teaches his students to be good scientists, they'll never have good careers because they'll be taught to be critical of their work and to publish slowly and to triple check everything and to be skeptical of everything they do and to publish negative results as well as positive results. And the research community frowns on all of this. So, somebody like me comes along, I could get away with it in the beginning because I had such a good track record with my investigative work previously, and I had a lot of supporters in the medical and scientific community who were so appreciative of my work. But the more I challenge the research community, the harder it gets to do it, because I become, there's Taubes again, he's saying the same crap again, it's all about, about calories, we've heard this, it's an old story. Even if you look at the reception to my two books, so The Case Against Sugar, which is built on this idea that obesity is not an energy balance disorder, it's a hormonal regulatory disorder that sugar particularly dysregulates. That book got much more attention than my latest case for keto, because The Case Against Sugar, I'm arguing something that everyone is willing to believe, and they'll ignore where we differ. But as soon as I go to The Case for Keto, that sounds like a fad diet book, right? And now, now we get a very much different response. It's interesting. In the UK, it was better than in the US. But so as long as I'm arguing what people want to believe, I can be taken seriously. As soon as I start arguing something that sounds faddish or a little too challenging for them, the easiest way to deal with it is just to ignore it.
I imagine I'm going to now meld one of my questions with a question from the audience. How much of this group think is deliberately encouraged by drug companies, and let me also think, and the dieting industry? It's a bazillion-dollar industry, and it's predicated on recidivism. It's predicated on the fact that you're going to go on the diet, but you're going to have to come back on the diet and back on the diet and back on the diet.
There are a lot of forces that work. This is why one of the reasons I mean, again, I'm usually criticizing the scientists, because I think most people are honest brokers and are doing the best they can out there. But there's so many forces working against these ideas once they're accepted. So, for instance, one of the things I did along the way is I co-founded a not-for-profit to fund research to test these hypotheses. Like, you could test this energy balance hypothesis. And we had backing from a Texas billionaire, so we had $30 million to spend, and we funded 4 studies. And we thought, if we really do some seminal research, we can change the ideas. But the research, it was a learning experience, let's just say that. But the research turned out to be ambiguous. The studies run by the people who didn't believe we were right found what they believed, and the studies done by people who did believe we were right found what they believed. But if you imagine one of these studies came up with definitive evidence, like we could show in humans what all the animal models show, which is that they'll get fat even when calorie restricted. And that article was published this week in the New England Journal of Medicine or Lancet. It's one of about 150 articles that's being published this week. And in the pipeline, maybe 10 weeks or 1,500 articles that have already been accepted, that all accept the dogma. And behind the pipeline are another 2,000 or 3,000 articles or 5,000 that have been written and submitted and not accepted. So you publish one article that has a signal. It should change how people think. And as people start to think about it, there's this tidal wave of conventional thinking, dogmatic articles that have been, that don't adjust. So it gets buried in the tidal wave. I think people in the pharmaceutical industry would do the best they could to understand this disease. They certainly make a lot of money treating diabetes and obesity. These are huge industries, but people have family members who have obesity and family members who have diabetes, and if there was a way they thought to treat them that didn't require injecting insulin or major bariatric surgery, I think they would embrace it eventually because they would want their family members to, the food and
Gary. We might then take right into, let's talk about what is a keto diet, because that's one way to work on this.
Okay.
Now, some of the hints are on the cover, some of the things we should be eating if we want to follow a keto diet. But, for some people here tonight, some people buying the book, they may want to not have a heart attack. They may want to lose weight. They want to know, what the hell do I eat? Why does it work? So, Gary, what should they eat? Okay,
so remember we talked Brillat-Savarin, 1825, more or less rigid abstinence to, he called it farinaceous foods and sugars, we'll call them carbohydrates. So the idea is very simple. Carbohydrates are fattening. For those of us who get fat easily, like lean people can tolerate it, just like some people can, healthy people, when they eat carbohydrates, their blood sugar doesn't go up. They don't have diabetes. With people with type 2 diabetes, when they eat carbohydrates, they need insulin to keep their carbs down. Insulin, as researchers realized beginning in the 1930s, and it was clear by the 1960s and some brilliant laboratory research, insulin is a hormone that accumulation. And we secrete insulin primarily to the carbohydrate content of our diet. So by the 1960s, the idea should have been carbohydrates are fattening. They're fattening. They work through insulin. Something about sugar and refined carbs seems to dysregulate insulin signaling. If you want to get fat out of your fat tissue, you have to lower insulin. And there's a threshold effect. This has been worked out by very good researchers. You've got to get insulin very low to get it to mobilize the fat you've stored and so your body can burn it for fuel. So a keto diet, which in the book I refer to it as low-carb, high-fat keto diet, because in all honesty, despite the title, I don't know how important ketosis is, and we could discuss that. You have more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrates. So grains, starches, legumes, beans, because they have high carb contents. You replace it primarily with dietary fat. So you're eating high fat, low carb diet. You could eat as much green leafy vegetables as you want. You just put, olive oil or butter on it. You can eat a ketogenic vegan diet. A vegan ketogenic diet. There are face groups out there with tens of thousands of members who do this. You could eat a vegetarian ketogenic diet. You're just restricting grains and starches, ideally beans and legumes, but then you have to get your protein from somewhere which doesn't have carbs attached. It's much harder to do. They tend to be animal product rich diets because animal products tend to be only fat and protein, and that's what you're focusing on in these diets. So when I was young, keto was called Atkins. When Atkins was young, keto was called Banting, although he didn't know that. More or less rigid abstinence to carbohydrate-rich foods.
But if you're following a keto diet, and one of your goals is weight loss, is it not true that you still have to watch quantities, or you still have to, can you get fat on a keto diet?
When I was doing my research for the book, I interviewed about 120 odd doctors for the book, and I always asked them, do you know anyone who got fat on a keto diet? I did find one physician of Indian descent who I interviewed, and he told me his story, and I believe that he got fat in a ketogenic diet. I don't know why. I don't know how it happened, but I believe that what he was telling me was true. And he said when he went on Atkins and he was religious, he gained like 30 pounds. For some huge proportion of the people, the idea is when your insulin is elevated, you're telling your body to burn carbohydrates and store the fat that you've stored in the fat tissue. So if you're eating a typical English or American diet with 50% of your calories from carbs and a lot of that from bread and French fries and breaded, the breading on your fish and chips, and you're drinking sugary sodas or drinking fruit juices in between and having beers, you're basically telling your body to burn carbohydrates all day long and store fat. And one of the reasons why you tend to be hungry all the time and snacking all the time is because you can't access the fat you've stored. Your muscles and organs don't want to burn that fat. And so if your insulin's elevated, which if you're overweight and obese, it almost assuredly is, your body wants to burn carbs. So now you lower insulin, you go on this keto thing, you lower insulin, you're eating, salmon, and let's say your breakfast is, you don't even have to have breakfast. You can intermittent fast, but let's say your breakfast is, eggs and lox, smoked salmon, and your lunch is, some chicken thighs and a green salad or a lot of oil on it, and your dinner is something similar. The idea is you're not going to be hungry in between meals because your insulin is low, you have access to the fat you've stored, and your body's burning that fat for fuel. Your cells are being fed whether or not you're eating. That's what the fat's there for. The problem you have is you can't access the fat. If you lower the insulin, you can access the fat. So that's the idea. Could you force yourself to eat too much?
Well,
Maybe.
I mean,
it'd be an interesting experiment. That's effectively.
Yeah, but some people don't. If you emotionally overeat, you don't pay attention to your body's satiety cues anyway, do you?
I'm a little skeptical of that science because that's always confounded by what you're emotionally eating. There are a few people in the world who say, yeah, I was stuffing myself with, cheddar yesterday because, I had a bad day at work and my mother's sick. And, so I had some Kerrygold butter with salt, and then I ate some cheddar cheese, and, I finished it off with a ribeye. It's the idea of emotional eating. I'm sure people do it, but the foods we tend to crave are also the foods that tend to stimulate insulin secretion. They're sweets, they're chips, might be there's the science to explain that as well. So the idea, and certainly there are people out there, by the way. So the way I phrase it in the book is, if you want to get fat out of your fat tissue, you have to lower your insulin levels. And the way you do that is get rid of the carbs in your diet and replace it with fat for the easily digestible carbs. So we're not talking green leaf vegetables, salad greens and broccoli. And some people will lose a lot of weight, and often with men particularly, I could say, look, what'd you weigh in high school? I can guarantee if you do this right, you'll get down to your high school weight, and you'll do it without being hungry, which is key. You'll just eat foods you like. Men my experience, tend to appreciate eggs and bacon and ribeyes more than necessarily my women friends in California anyway. Some people, there are a lot of hormones that influence fat accumulation. Women, because when you get pregnant, you need to put on fat to feed the baby after birth. You have hormones that drive fat accumulation that are not so much problems with men. And as menopause sets in, these hormones drop and fat accumulation increases. So there were people who will never be as lean as they want to be, or as lean as they may have been once. But the argument that I'm making in the case for keto is that by minimizing the carb content of their diet, they'll be as healthy as they possibly can be. They'll, reverse this metabolic syndrome, these propensity to type 2 diabetes, and they'll be as lean as they can be without starving themselves. Because I think once you start starving yourself, you do damage. And probably will fail and rebound.
Yeah. One of our listeners is asking, is all fruit off the menu?
Not all fruit, but most fruit. Berries are the sort of fruit of choice in the low carb world because they have a very low fructose content. That's the very low sugar content and high fiber to carb content. So blueberries, blackberries, I tend to eat them in season. It's one of the interesting things about living in Northern California. And they come into season, a couple of weeks, blueberries will come into season. And it's my favorite time of year. And I probably get fatter during that time of year. Apples, oranges, well, fruit juices are out. Because fruit juices, you could take basically the sugar and content from 4 or 5 pieces of fruit and put it into an 8-ounce glass and drink it in 2 minutes. It's a good idea to avoid fruit. This book, The Case for Keto, the original title was How to Think About How to Eat. Okay, and what I wanted to do was take everything I had learned doing this intensive research over the course of a decade and everything I learned from these 120 odd physicians from around the world, a lot in the UK, by the way, how to think about this problem when you're one of these people like us who fatten easily and who have trouble controlling your blood pressure and your blood sugar, which are metabolic syndrome issues. There's been a tendency over the years you think about, I'm going to go keto, and you immediately start thinking, what can I get away with? I get less of these questions now than I used to, but it used to be like, what can I have a potato once a week? Do I have to do this every day, or can I do it 6 days a week? And all of those, some people can have potato every day and be lean, and some people, if they just get rid of the sugary beverages and the beer, can be lean, and some people, can be lean even on the sugary. But best way to approach it if you've got a serious weight or health issue is the way I think it is, as though you were a smoker who wanted to quit smoking or a drinker who wanted to quit drinking. You would recognize the challenge, and you wouldn't say, well, I'm going to quit smoking, but I'm going to allow myself to have 3 cigarettes every Friday night when I go to the bar, because that's going to fail. Nobody's going to suggest to somebody with an alcohol problem that they cut back to 2 drinks a day and expect that to work. So the idea is, and a lot of the physicians I interviewed said they think about this as not so much their programs, not so much as weight loss programs, but carbohydrate addiction programs. Just set yourself a goal, say 3 months, I'm going to do this religiously. I can do 3 months. I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to read the book so I understand what's happening. I'm going to go down the rabbit hole. And at the end of 3 months, I could see that's enough time to know, is this really look like something I could sustain? And has it changed my life enough? If I've lost 30 pounds in 3 months, maybe I want to keep doing this for the rest of my life.
And just 2 quick questions. Another question is, what about the importance of fiber? And thinking of all the research on the microbiome and what it needs.
Fiber is an interesting issue. I talk about the history of the fiber research in my first book, which was published as A Diet Delusion in the UK. And it came out of research that was done by a British naval researcher named Peter Cleve, who had traveled around the world and collected evidence from all around the world and said, look, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, they're all caused by refined grains and sugars. And then another British researcher named Dennis Burkitt, a missionary physician in Uganda who was very famous for some earlier work, came along and said, well, we're never going to get people to stop eating beer and stop drinking beer and sugar. Maybe it's not the presence of these foods, these refined grains and sugars. Maybe it's the absence of fiber when you refine these foods. So that's the birth of the fiber hypothesis, was the argument I've been making. But we can't tell people to do that, so let's blame it on fiber. And Burkitt was obsessed with constipation for reasons I don't quite understand, but seems to be more common on your side of the Atlantic than ours. Anyway, so that's it. The gut biome, when I was growing up and writing about physics in my first 2 books on bad science, the physicists used to describe the front lines of science as like little kids playing soccer. So what they meant by that is that somebody would kick the ball over here and football would call in the UK. Somebody would kick the ball over here and all the kids run after it. And then they kick the ball over here and all the kids run after it. Like, Mom, remember the Monty Python cartoons? And you never knew where the goals were if you just watched the ball, because everybody was running after the ball. That's a sort of fashionable, faddist aspect of science. The gut biome is where the ball has been kicked over the last decade. Suddenly we have a new technology available. We could, get the genomes of the bacteria in our guts so we could classify different bacterial populations, and it's in our guts. We have obesity. They must be connected. I'm still skeptical. It's fashionable. It's faddish. Give it 20 years and we'll see where the goals are. At the moment, it's where the kids are chasing after the balls.
Another of our viewers.
Wait, one last point.
Yeah.
In a keto diet or a low-carb, high-fat diet or a carb-restricted diet or whatever you want to call it, remember, you're eating a lot of protein and fat, but you're eating it with as many green leafy vegetables as you want, so you can have plenty of fiber in your diet. What's fascinating is that there's a carnivore movement now, which is like the extreme version of this, where they only eat meat and they eat no fiber at all, and they seem to be fine. Okay, which is one of these things that if I were a nutritionist, I would want to study, because it goes against everything they've been taught. But these people seem to be fine and not taking fiber supplements, as far as I know. Green leafy vegetables. People do get constipated when they start any dietary approach. It's a common phenomenon. Keto, low carb, high fat, one way to deal with it is you lose a lot of body water when you stop consuming carbohydrates for reasons that have been known for 150 years. It's one reason why your blood pressure goes down, which is a good thing. With the body water, you lose a lot of electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, potassium. So you have to kind of supplement those back, and that typically takes care of what's called the keto flu. And people like me tend to drink a lot of chicken broth, and then we put salt in it, whether we need it or not. I grew up with a Jewish mother, so it seems like it's got to be a good thing, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah. Another of our listeners is asking if he should take statins for high cholesterol. And if not, why are so many people put on them?
Oh, that's a very complicated question, and it's an issue I tend to avoid. But I will say, it's sort of the cosmic joke with these. Remember, I'm talking about the 1960s. The heart disease community latches onto this hypothesis that we get heart disease because the saturated fat in our diet raises LDL cholesterol, which it tends to do in comparison to carbohydrates. It also raises a good cholesterol, HDL, but that's too complicated for our medical community to discuss at length. And then simultaneously, you have this other hypothesis that the problem is the carbohydrate content of the diet working through insulin and metabolic syndrome. So you remove the carbs, you replace the carbs with fat, and a lot of people see their LDL cholesterol go up, sometimes dramatically. And a more informed measure of risk is a number of LDL particles in your blood, and that often goes up. So one of the questions is, if you are eating this way and your LDL cholesterol goes up, your LDL particle number goes up, should you stop eating this way, or should you eat this way and take a statin, or should you ignore it? Under the assumption that the LDL is the wrong way to understand heart disease, just as it's calories are the wrong way to understand obesity. And it's an incredibly controversial question. You'll get different answers. The way I deal with it in my book is I say, look, my LDL cholesterol goes up when I eat this way, but I don't have a family history of heart disease. So my men on my father's side of the family tend to live into their 90s. The men in my mother's side of the family tend to go crazy in their 60s and 70s. So, depending whose genes I've got, I'm not sure I have to worry about it. So I'm going to make the decision not to worry about it. But if it was somebody who came from a family history of heart disease, the argument that you should take statins just to be like a low dose drug like Lipitor, just to hedge your bets, is a compelling argument. The last point is, I forget what the last point is, so we'll let it go.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and I would like to. I'm one of those. There's one thing in your book that made me so happy. I used to jokingly say to people, I can get fat just by smelling food, and in your book, I find out that this is in fact true. There's something sort of true. And I'm going to mispronounce this. Is it cephalic phase effect?
Cephalic phase.
Could you please, for those of us who feel that even walking past a bakery is dangerous, can you explain what these are and how this works?
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to say all of this that's considered by the mainstream medical community to be the provenance of fad diets, all people like me do is we say, look, obesity is a sort of excess fat accumulation. Okay, fat accumulation is regulated physiologically by hormones and enzymes in the central nervous system. The science was worked out very well from the 1930s to the 1970s. And unlike you guys who say we get fat who eat too much, we say the science is relevant to obesity. And if you understand it, you might solve obesity. If you ignore it, you never will. So we secrete insulin, as I said, primarily in response to the carbohydrates in our diet, because carbohydrates make up about 50% of our diet. It's an interesting problem. When you start consuming, the insulin works slowly. So by the time you start eating the carbohydrates, you better have insulin in your bloodstream to control the blood sugar going to start going up as you digest and absorb those carbohydrates. So your body actually secretes insulin before you start eating, when you start thinking about eating. Okay? So this is called the cephalic phase. Cephalic means above the neck. Okay, so you start, and a lot of the insulin, I just saw that more than most of the insulin you're secreted is cephalic, and that was in a comment on Twitter. I don't know if it's true or not. I never really thought about it. But just thinking about food, like if I say the words fresh hot donuts, or actually use a French term, beignets, you ever have them in Paris? It's like there's nothing better. And you're probably starting to salivate, which is a classic Pavlovian response. Well, part of the Pavlovian response is insulin secretion. And remember, insulin tells your fat tissue to store fat. So as soon as you start secreting insulin, and your fat tissue is very sensitive to insulin, so you think about eating, and your fat tissue says, hold on to the fat. So it's like almost instantaneously, you could think of it as getting fatter. You're actually just stop getting thinner at the moment you start thinking about it. So you walk by, and the example I use in the book is two people walking by a bakery or a Cinnabon store in the airport, where they pump out the smell, officially through, I'm sure they do, through fans to get you to smell it, because they're aware of this phenomenon. They may not understand the physiology, but somebody who's overweight, obese, insulin resistant, they smell that cinnamon bun, they start to think about insulin, secrete insulin. They're going to over secrete insulin. And now their body's going to store all their fat calories and they're going to start craving carbohydrates for fuel, and the carbs are in the cinnamon bun. So they literally almost literally start to starve for the cinnamon bun as soon as they smell it. Whereas the lean person doesn't experience that phenomenon because his insulin signaling is working fine. He doesn't oversecrete insulin. He continues to be able to live off the fat he's stored. So the person who's overweight goes into the store and everybody around goes, yeah, look at that guy's fat because he's eating a cinnamon bun, without any understanding of the underlying physiology that's making him crave that food. And if the joke is, if the lean guy goes in, nobody cares if he eats a cinnamon bun or not because he's lean. And one of the last thing I'll say, one of the points I make in this book over and over again, from Louis Newberg onward, maybe even before Louis Newberg, we've been getting diet advice from thin people who say, this is what I do. If those fat people just ate like I did, they'd be thin too. And what they never understood is that we're different than them. We get fat eating the foods that they can stay lean on. So maybe the advice has to be different. But for 100 years, the advice has been eat like your thin friends and you'll be fine, when all of us who's fat and easily know we're not fine when we eat that way. And yet we're taught to blame ourselves rather than to blame, God forbid, the scientists for this lousy advice we've been given.
That is the most wonderful place and life-affirming place to end on. I'll just remind everyone listening that Gary's books are available in the bookshop. And normally I would ask everyone to make a massive round of applause for you now. I'll have to do it myself. Gary, thank you so much. This has been an amazing hour. I've loved this conversation.
Well, thank you, Leigh. It's been great. Okay.